I'd like to invite you to remain standing as we hear this morning's gospel lesson. In real estate, they have a little catchphrase I think probably most of you are familiar with that says there are three things that are important about a piece of real estate, and they are location, location, and location. Well, when you're doing study of the Bible and literature, sometimes location is supremely important. This story comes immediately before Jesus heads toward Jerusalem for the final week of his life. And so it's the last story of his public ministry before he enters Jerusalem. And so that alone says this is an important story. This was an important thing. And we'll talk a little bit more about some of the unique qualities of this story as we dig into it in a few minutes. But let's begin by hearing it. They came to Jericho. As he and his disciples and a large crowd were leaving Jericho, Bartimaeus, son of Timaeus, a blind beggar, was sitting by the roadside. When he heard that it was Jesus of Nazareth, he began to shout out and say, "Jesus, son of David, have mercy on me." Many sternly ordered him to be quiet, but he cried out even more loudly, "Son of David, have mercy on me." Jesus stood still and said, "Call him here." And they called the blind man, saying to him, "Take heart, get up, he is calling you." So throwing off his cloak, he sprang up and came to Jesus. Then Jesus said to him, "What do you want me to do for you?" And the blind man said to him, "My teacher, let me see again." Jesus said to him, "Go, your faith has made you well." Immediately he regained his sight and followed Jesus on the way. This is the word of God for the people of God. Thanks be to God. You may be seated. So there are so many parts of this story that are important as it comes in its place. We'll talk about those in a few minutes. Before I wanted to mention, it's that time of year. When I was a child, this time of year, my parents brought into our house what I considered at the time the ultimate book of hope, the Sears catalog. And we as children were to kind of look through the Sears catalog and, kind of identify toys that we thought we were particularly interested in within a price range. And ironically, somehow from Sears catalog to Santa Claus ears, all of these things would come to fruition. As I began to get older, and in the most recent years, when it becomes my birthday or holidays like that, and my children and wife Michelle would ask me, "What is it that you want for your birthday?" My immediate response would always be, "I want us to do something together. I want us to be together." So I've kind of changed from this, kind of the glitzy toy gift, whatever, to being together. When we think about last week's story and this week's story and the contrast to the two and the comparisons of the two, last week James and John came to Jesus and they had a petition, and Jesus said to them, "What do you want me to do?" And they had a response: "We want to sit at your right and your left in your glory." In other words, we want to be in a place of prominence. And there was this whole interaction. And I don't think there's any accident in Mark's gospel that this story follows that story. There are a lot of comparisons. And in this story, Jesus and his disciples are in Jericho. Now, Jericho's an interesting city to visit. In Indiana, we have cities when you drive in, it says, whatever your town is. My town's Jeffersonville, Indiana, my hometown. So you drive in Jeffersonville, it says Jeffersonville, Indiana, boys basketball champions 1995, which is when we won the, that's the way it is in Indiana. You drive into Jericho, and it says, "Welcome to Jericho, world's oldest city." How do you compete with that? So several thousand years people have lived in Jericho. And one of the things about Jericho, it's right on the Dead Sea, so it is at the lowest spot in the world. And so if you travel from Jericho to Jerusalem, even though Jerusalem is not terribly high, it has an elevation of 2,500 feet or so. From Jericho, there's no way to go but up. You know, you leave there, you're gonna go up. And it wasn't the safest road in Jesus' time. It's not even the safest road today. But in Jesus' time, bandits often frequented that road. And so, like the story of the Good Samaritan, which involves someone who has been, had an act of violence perpetrated upon them by bandits, happened on the road between Jericho and Jerusalem. So the moment they leave Jericho, they are setting their feet on a dangerous path that will end in Jerusalem, which, as we know, becomes a very dangerous place for Jesus and ultimately culminates in his death and eventual resurrection. So this is the path they're about ready. And the disciples, even though Jesus has now for 3 times, when we talked about last week, tried to expound upon what's going to happen next, they have not gotten it. They have been stricken with a sense of spiritual and cognitive blindness. And so this story is kind of a contrast to their blindness. Here is this person who is physically blind, but spiritually and cognitively sees so much more than the disciples are able to see. And Bartimaeus becomes kind of the model in many ways of how to respond to Jesus in the Gospel of Mark. And so there are several contrasts. First of all, Bartimaeus is there. He calls out and he says, "Son of David, have mercy on me." The only other person that addressed Jesus as Son of David or with a messianic title was Peter, the disciple. And immediately after he does that, he renounces Jesus' need to suffer, and that's when Jesus says, "Get behind me, Satan." So it didn't last long. But Bartimaeus recognizes who Jesus is. He says, "Son of David," which is a messianic title, "have mercy on me." Now, I suspect the disciples' response, particularly if we're informed by last week's story where James and John are all about prominence, I suspect that their immediate response was, "Jesus, we don't have time for this. This is an inconsequential person alongside the road. We don't have time for it. We've got to get moving, and we need to be diligent." And Jesus says, "Call him here." And so there is this sense of call of Jesus. Again, this is kind of the summary story of all that Jesus has done as he has called disciples and he has drawn them to him. Even a few weeks ago, we talked about him drawing the children to him. So Jesus says, "Call him here." And they come to Bartimaeus and they say, "You are fortunate. You're one lucky guy. Jesus is calling you." And so he drops his cloak and follows him. Now, it was probably likely that this cloak that he discarded in this moment was everything that he owned. And so, again, this kind of goes back to the story where Jesus has talked to the rich young ruler, asked him to leave everything behind, and he has refused to do it. Here, Bartimaeus leaves all that he owns and comes to Jesus. You see the pattern here as he's just kind of culminating all of these stories, bringing them together. And so Bartimaeus comes to Jesus, and Jesus asks him, "What do you want me to do for you?" The same question he asked James and John. James and John answered, we want to be the top dogs. We want to be on your right and your left. But Bartimaeus said, "I want you to give me sight. I want you to help me see." And Jesus says, "Granted, I'm going to let you see." And I think there is a lot more in that statement than just physical sight. Bartimaeus sees things more clearly than any of the disciples. And he sees the reality of who Jesus is, of what Jesus is about, what's going to happen. There is a spiritual sight and clarity unparalleled with the other disciples in this moment. And so Jesus says, I'm going to grant your request. I'm going to heal you. And then Bartimaeus is healed, and it says he follows Jesus and becomes a disciple. This is the only story in the New Testament where someone that Jesus healed became a disciple. It's the only story. In the other stories, they go off rejoicing. They go to the priest to show their healing if they have leprosy. There are all kinds of different responses. But this is the only time when someone is touched with the healing touch of Jesus Christ, and the result is they become a disciple of Jesus Christ. So you see how this is the great example story of what it means to be Jesus' disciple. And it also reminds us of the contrast between what Jesus saw in people and sees in people and what his disciples were able to see and comprehend. We have this series of stories, beginning with the children, where they don't see the potential that Jesus sees in people around him. These few weeks we're talking about opportunity. Opportunity knocks, and I've chosen to kind of central about divine opportunity and how God presents opportunities in our lives. And our prayer ought to be, God, give me eyes to see. One of the great indictments Jesus made of people around him was they have eyes but they don't see. They have ears but they don't hear. They don't perceive what God is about. A few years ago, I was pastoring at a church on the south side of Indianapolis in Southport. And after worship, one of the church members handed me a book. Now, that's not that unusual in my life because people know that I'm a reader and people have books that they like. And this person grew up in Evansville, and so they really wanted me to have this book. And it was a collection of stories by an Evansville pastor or professor named Walt Wangerin. I don't know if you're familiar with Walt Wangerin at all, but he had won at that time a number of book awards. He was teaching writing at the University of Evansville. He left there a little while after that and has been writer in residence at Valparaiso University for a number of years and is now dying of cancer, so he's toward the end of his life. But she handed me a book called Ms. Lill and the Chronicles of Grace. And she said, I want you to read this because it's Grace in the title is about Grace Lutheran Church, where Walt Wangerin was the pastor. And it's stories about his parishioners in this mostly African-American inner-city church in Evansville and his experiences and how God showed up in those experiences. And so she said, I want you to read this because she grew up in Evansville and she wanted me to, she thought the Evansville flavor was pretty nice. And I have to say, we moved to Southwest Indiana a little while after that and lived there for 4 years. And it was nice to kind of have you know how that is if a book is set in a place that you've been. But I remember Walt Wangerin tells stories about Grace Lutheran Church, and one of them really stuck with me, and it's the story of a man named Robert. Robert lived in the neighborhood, and he didn't get around well, so he had what looked at first like a cane, but it was really an umbrella that had everything stripped off of it. So it was just the main shaft of an umbrella with a handle, and Robert would tap around the neighborhood with this umbrella. And he was a frequent visitor to the church's food pantry and clothing thrift store, and so he had a relationship with the church in which the church had helped him. And he was one of those people, Walt Wangerin, Walt would walk around the neighborhood, and if he was in a hurry and he saw Robert coming, he would change his direction, because he knew this: if you entered into a conversation with Robert, you were going to be there for a while. Most of us know people like that. We may be people like that. I don't know. So Robert was one day, Walt was walking the neighborhood. He had visited somebody at the hospital. He had stopped in the community development office to make some connections. And he was walking back to the church, and Robert was sitting outside of his apartment, and Walt Wangerin recognized that he was sitting there too late. And so Robert grabbed him. He said, I want you to come in, Pastor. Preacher. He called him Preacher. I want you to come in. So he came in his apartment, and there was a single bed, a little wooden table with a wooden chair, a little hot plate with a little pan of food with roaches kind of wrestling over what was left. And so he had this But he said Robert invited him, and he sat down on the chair. And Robert, under the little lone sink that was there, had a box. And he brought his box out, and he said, preacher, your church has been there for me through the years. You've helped me with food. You've helped me with clothes. And he started bringing things out of this cardboard box, a broken toaster, a book that was pretty raggedy, different things. These were clearly his treasures. And he laid them out on the bed, and he said, preacher, pick one. Take one. The church has given so much to me, I want to give something back to you. And Walt Wongren says, I didn't know what to do. He said, we don't need his treasures. I don't know what. So he said, Robert, I so appreciate the thought, but, we don't give things to people. This isn't a transaction. We're happy to do that. I don't need to take your treasures. And he was able to kind of extricate himself from the situation. And next Sunday, he was getting ready to lead worship, and he had gotten up in front of the congregation, much like I am now, gotten fairly far into his sermon, much like I am now. And suddenly he looked up and he saw at the back center aisle Robert standing there with his cane-like umbrella, kind of wobbling. And much like this church, there weren't any, easy, empty seats until you got to the front. And so Robert walked all the way down the aisle and sat in the second row on the left. And Walt Wongren kind of was preaching in the first row. And so Robert was about there, and Walt was beginning to finish up his sermon. And all of a sudden, Robert stood up and he says, I'm going to pray now. And Walt said, No, Robert, you can't pray now. We have a particular time when you pray. And he said, and he sat down. He was disappointed, and there were a couple of people sitting beside him. And as Walt was trying to finish the sermon, he could hear Robert kind of apologizing to the other people. I didn't know there was a particular time to pray. And so after the sermon, they had the offering. So they did things in a little different order. And they were doing the offering, and Walt was coming to the chancel to take the offering plates, and he turned around, and as he turned around, there was Robert. And he said Robert had fished out of his pocket a dollar bill. He said it was worn. It was like tissue paper. It was so worn. And Robert said, I'm not going to pray for you all anymore. And he put the money in the plate. And he walked out of the church muttering to himself, I'm done praying for these people. And Walt said to himself, what do we need with his $1 when we have lost his prayers? All because I didn't recognize what he had to give. It's easy for us sometimes to say, we want to give something. We want to contribute. We want to help someone. But part of the message of Jesus Christ is recognizing that everyone has something to give. Everyone needs to contribute. Everyone, like Robert, wants to repay the congregation that gave him so much by giving of his treasure or by praying. And when we don't accept those gifts, it would be like Jesus along the road saying, no, I don't have time for Bartimaeus today. So as we think about what it means to give to the church, as we think about what does it mean to be involved in serving in a soup kitchen or hosting people with IHN, let it be part of our prayer, not just that we might contribute, but that we might see the gift of Christ in each person in whose contact we come. That we might recognize the voice of a disciple who can say, have mercy on me, Son of David. Let it be our prayer to see with a sense of heavenly sight what Christ has for us, how Christ might use us to touch other people's lives, but also how others might be used to touch our lives, to value their treasure, to value who they are, to welcome them as disciples of Jesus Christ. This morning, we hear the story of someone who was touched by God. And as we encounter Christ, all of us are touched by God. Let us accept that gift, not only of God's presence and God's great grace in our lives, but let us pray, Lord, give me sight. Help me to see you in everyone that I encounter in my life. Like Bartimaeus, help me to recognize that you are here, you are present, and each person has a gift to bring to you. Let us pray. Almighty and holy God, the world gives us a criteria by which we see other people, but it's not yours. You call us to see each person as a child of God, a wonder to behold, as someone who has a gift to give and has a life to devote to your purpose. Help us to be that person and help us to see that person. Amen.